You're listening to the Integrative Health Simplified podcast with Kari, Coody, pharmacist turned integrative health practitioner. Here we talk all things straightforward and honest when it comes to holistic health and simplifying your best steps forward while eliminating all the gimmicks and confusion. Leave the overwhelm at the door and get ready for impactful action steps that get to the real root of your issue and actually move the needle in your health. Let's dive into the show. Hey guys, it's Kari here and welcome back into another episode of the Integrative Health Simplified podcast. We are continuing on a series all about women's health. I called this series Women's Health Fact versus Fiction because we do hear a lot of things when we're chatting with our friends, when we are even at the doctor's office that maybe seem really common but aren't necessarily normal. So that was the whole reason behind the series, just to share some things particularly about women's health and what we can expect as we age. So I wanted to do this episode all about what tests should we consider as we age and really just as women in general. So I'll kind of start out with very generally, we should be getting a full, complete panel of lab work done every single year. And sometimes when we think like blood work done, and we don't necessarily know exactly what the doctor's doing, they're doing the very, very minimum. And a lot of times they look at it and say, it looks great, and you don't feel great. So that happens a ton. I just can't tell you how many times I've heard that from my clients that come and they're like, yeah, I don't feel good, but they said everything was fine. So sometimes they just aren't looking at all the markers that you really need to look at. And oftentimes in the conventional world, they're looking at wide ranges of these markers. And so for something to be off, it would have to be really off for it to show up by their standards. And so between those two things, I feel like it's really important to ask them, if you're going to the regular doctor, to do some of these complete panels. Usually what they leave off of a complete panel is a thyroid panel that is really complete. A lot of times they'll just do the TSH, which is a thyroid stimulating hormone. And while that can tell us some, it doesn't tell us nearly enough about the full picture of what your thyroid's doing. And I'm really highlighting the thyroid here because it is a great indicator to kind of tell us when the body is feeling stress, how it's feeling stress. It can tell us a lot about maybe more of the ripple effects that are happening from that. And it can kind of give us an indication of things to come. And it helps us stay on top of our health, I believe, in a more proactive way to really look at this thyroid panel in the full sense. And so I'm not going to go through every single marker just for sake of time, but that is something that I find is really, really key to do every year, is a full thyroid panel, but really as part of a really comprehensive blood panel. Another thing is an HTMA, and that's a hair tissue mineral analysis test. And this can really tell us a lot about our stress patterns. Of course, it can tell us also how the thyroid is doing. It can tell us how we can better support the body very specifically with food and maybe even some supplementation. And so to do this every year is just a really great routine thing to do. So those are the two, comprehensive blood panel and HTMA, that I recommend yearly. Really, I mean, any age would benefit from that, but I would say 30 plus to do that. You know, if you are 30 years of age and older, you need to be doing these every year. So that's kind of just general, but I did want to go into a little bit more specific scenarios of additional tests that you might want to consider. And so all of these would kind of include that comprehensive panel that I mentioned, plus others. So if you, I'm kind of go through some scenarios here. So if you are more of like a young adult female and you're having a lot of the issues that I'm going to mention, like painful periods, PCOS, maybe you've been diagnosed with that, endometriosis, if you're not having a cycle, if you're struggling with infertility, if you are having migraines, if you're having a lot of fluctuations in your cycle, like really long cycles and then really short cycles, maybe you're not having a cycle at all. Like all of these things would put you into this category. So I like to run a few extra markers kind of to see what's going on a blood panel, and then also do something called a Dutch test. So we'll talk about the Dutch test in just a minute, but the extra blood markers that I like to look for, leptin can be really helpful, prolactin, even estrogen and progesterone, testosterone, FSH, and LH. Those are some that I like to look at in a blood panel. Now, blood's not going to tell us like the whole picture, but it can help us to see different parts. And so I like to combine the blood markers with the Dutch test, because the Dutch test is a dried urine test, and it's going to just tell us more about the metabolites of these hormones. And what that tells us is how our body is using the hormones, because the blood just tells us what's there, and the Dutch test can tell us how your body is utilizing it, which is super, super helpful in kind of seeing where's the breakdown here. Is it that you don't have enough, or is it that your body's not really fully utilizing it? And so there are a couple of different types of Dutch tests. I really like to use the cycle mapping Dutch test when you're thinking about this type of person that's experiencing this issues, because it's going to help us look at the entire menstrual cycle. And that's really important when you think about seeing where the breakdown is and what's causing these symptoms. So that is a little bit about that category. Now, you could also fall under the preconception, postpartum category in those that I just mentioned. So I'm going to kind of lump those together. And so one other category that I'll kind of talk about is the perimenopausal, menopausal. So I really love a lot of those same markers that I mentioned earlier. They can all be super helpful. I also like to look at DHEA and DHEAS in this particular category of women, because it can tell us a lot about, what these hormones are doing, which, a lot of these things, you have a breakdown in these hormones during this time. And so we can kind of see where that might be when we run some of these blood panels. And then a Dutch test can also be helpful for perimenopausal and menopausal women, but I really like Dutch Complete versus the cycle mapping. And so this is a very similar test. It just kind of does it on a little bit of it goes about it in a different way. So it's 5 dried urine samples that are taken over a 24-hour period. And it's taken on the 20th day of your cycle. Now, there are certain ways we can get around this if you don't have a cycle, or if your cycle is really kind of wacky. There are ways around that. But it really represents an entire day's worth of hormones. And so it has cortisol and melatonin, and it has different patterns that we can see of really what's going on with your hormones. And so how they're being metabolized can really tell us a lot. So that is kind of in a nutshell, the test I like to look for, specifically when it relates to hormonal issues and even different times in your life, of course. And so I find that a lot of times we are only doing these tests when there is an issue. But I really want you to hear me when I say, as you enter that perimenopausal, menopausal phase of your life, which typically you're going to enter perimenopause around 40 to 43. That's kind of a generalized age range. It's really great to do these tests then, not necessarily wait until you're having a lot of symptoms to have tests like this run, because you want to get on top of things that might be showing kind of early, signs that, hey, you're going to have issues with this and that later. You want to go ahead and get on top of that now. And so, whenever we enter perimenopause and menopause, obviously our ovaries stop producing as much hormone and our adrenals take over. So the people that do the best going into perimenopause and menopause have the best adrenals functioning adrenals. And so if your adrenals continue to be stressed, 30s to 40s, and you're entering menopause, you're going to have a really hard time with that transition because there's going to be even more emphasis placed on your adrenal function. And so just kind of considering some of these things and really working on those things to restore them, because you can definitely restore. Our body is made to heal, right? And so you're not doomed. This isn't, and I talked about this on a previous episode, but we're not doomed when we go through some of these changes. It's just that our body, we want it to work properly, right? We want to give it what it needs. We want to remove what shouldn't be there or replace what's not there. And so just kind of making some of these tweaks can make a world of difference as we go through this change in our life, because it's just a change that everybody goes through, and it's not doesn't have to be just this terrible time in our life as a female. So I find that this is really great to do right around that 40-year-old, 40, 43 age range. And you just get this done and kind of see where you are and get some things to work on and get you going in the right direction. And so that is a little bit about hormonal, kind of lumping that together. But what about alternative tests to consider when you have a lot of GI issues? I really like to point people to the GI map when it comes to alternative tests to consider when you have a lot of gut-based issues, because obviously our gut does affect a lot of other things in our body. And so if you are having a ton of gut-based symptoms, it can be really great to do a GI map to see what's overgrown, maybe what you don't have, like if there's beneficial bacteria that you don't have enough of, if that's throwing things off. There's so many different things that we can see from a GI map. It's not perfect, but it can tell us a lot. We can optimize those things, and that does really play into us as women with hormonal issues. And so that is something that you might want to consider as additional testing to, do if you have a lot of GI-based symptoms, or if you just want to be preventative. A lot of people do GI maps just to see what's going on. They might not have a ton of issues, but they want to optimize their health. And especially as we age, our body is going to really thrive if we remove what's not supposed to be there and give it what it doesn't have enough of. So that can really help us. The GI map can really help us with what's there that might need to be removed so that it can function better, properly. So those are just some testing to consider. Now, I know that as we age, there are certain tests that our doctor tells us that are standard, mandatory for certain ages. Maybe if you're a female, certain ages, whatnot. One of those is a mammogram. So that is something that they're going to recommend at certain ages. And so, as you age. And so I really like to consider thermography and then even ultrasound therapy as another option for a mammogram. And so this is a very personal decision. So just to do more research on that, but I'm bringing this up not to tell you what to do, but to encourage you to look into other options for yourself. Because when something's standard for every female or standard for every person, I don't necessarily agree that it's the right thing for everybody. I'm not saying that it couldn't be the right thing for some people, but I don't think it's the right thing for everybody. And so I just want to encourage you to look into other things, because sometimes we don't even realize that there are other options if we don't want to go the conventional route. And so those are two that you can look into. Now, of course, they are going to say, I think it's now age 50 is a colonoscopy, and then every 10 years after that, I believe. But sometimes that changes, so don't quote me on that. But a colonoscopy is something that that is also another personal decision. Now, I know that obviously if you have a family history of certain things, I would definitely encourage you to go that route. But, again, this is something that has to be taken case by case. A GI map won't necessarily replace a colonoscopy by any means, but it can definitely help to obviously clean up the gut, get it functioning like we want it to, which obviously will help digestion overall and health overall. So these are just something to consider whenever you are aging and they are telling you need certain tests as you age. So I hope this helps, guys. This episode was just to really inform you that there are things that we can do preventatively, and that I would really encourage you to do preventatively and not necessarily wait until you're really desperate or until you feel terrible. Certainly, there is hope when you feel that way, but it's so much easier to get ahead of the curve on some of these things. And so I hope this episode helped you to be able to think preventatively and to really put some of these things on your radar. Now, all of these panels that I mentioned and Dutch tests, of course, I run those on my clients. So you can visit my website. I'll put that in the I was going to say my bio, but I'll put that in the show notes or in the description of this video. And you can check that out for how I work with clients. And obviously, if you have any questions, you can always email me. I'll put my email in the description and in the show notes as well. I'll see you guys on the next episode. If this episode has served you in any way, I would love it if you'd share any aha moments or takeaways over on Instagram and tag me at Kari Coody. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button so we can continue to learn and grow together.